I've got to speak up, somebody tells me. Okay, I'm speaking up, and then I shall sit down. I'd just like to add my thanks to Suzanne's for your coming today. I would particularly like to thank the Felixstowe Book Festival for having this bright idea. There have been moments when I thought, God, not another of Meg's bright ideas, but it's a lovely idea. And here we all are doing something different. You'll find maps scattered around if you'd like to go to the Suffolk Yacht Harbour. You'll find a beautiful yawl duet on pontoon F, and open to visitors, or open to anybody who just wants to come and sit on board and read their book, whatever they want to do. And you'll find Peter Duck down there as well. Our sponsors are Barker Goatley, the River Deepen Association, the Nancy Brackett Trust. I'd particularly like to thank David and Alison Vickers for doing the lovely map. And now I'm going to stand aside and just for a minute thank my friend Peter Wain, who is Mr. Everything here, because he's a volunteer at the Two Sisters. He's a member of the River Deepen Association, and he's a really assiduous and fascinating historian. And I've just discovered that I've printed out some copies of his paper on the lost port of Gosford, and I've left them in my car. Grab me later if you want to read Peter's paper, because I've printed it and I've got it, but now I'm going to hand over to him, and thank you all for coming, and let's have a lovely day.
Well, you've had two speakers. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Okay. Well, Suffolk's coastline has always been in conflict with the sea, and sometimes the tussle resolves itself in favour of the land. And so we'll go into statistics. Over 30% of Suffolk's coastal zone is actually reclaimed from the sea and marshland. But sometimes the sea wins, and what better demonstration of that is the destruction of Dunwich, firstly in the mighty storms of 1286 to 1288, and again in the early 1340s, so recent stuff. And it's recorded in the storms of 1340 that over 600 houses in Dunwich were lost. The harbour entrance was permanently blocked, and remember, in the 14th century, Dunwich was one of the 10 most important towns in the whole of the country, so it was a big event. And the entrance to the River Blythe was shifted about a mile up the coast, so that was a real triumph for the sea. You will therefore not be surprised to know that there are over 200 kilometres of sea and river banks protecting the coastal zone. One person who I'm sure would have dearly loved to have had that protection is our panellist Juliet Blaxland. Juliet grew up in East Suffolk and for a period of years lived, I think we can say, perilously close to the cliff edge, near the lost village of Easton Bavance. In her award-winning book, The Easternmost House, she describes in vivid detail a year in the life on the edge. And this is a book which has been described as being destined to be a 21st century classic. It's a memoir about landscape, food, and the disconnect between town and country. And it was such a successful book that it won the Times Nature Book of 2019, in addition to other awards, and it was shortlisted for the East Anglian Book Award. The success of the book was followed by a second book, The Easternmost Sky, in which Juliet explores how climate and social change are already affecting, or continue to affect the Suffolk coast, and how we need to adapt and change. And she also describes poignantly, if I may say so, what it's like to leave your home as what she describes as an environmental refugee before the cliff went into the sea. Our second panellist is Robert Simper. Robert has lived all his life in Suffolk, close to the North Sea, and for the last 63 years has lived alongside the River Deepen at Ramsholt, the village that was the subject of his latest book. He is a keen and knowledgeable historian of the locality. He's a sailor, farmer, a journalist, but most important of all, an author. He's published, I think the last count is 42 books, which are about marine history, sailing boats, and books about the English and East Anglian coast. They are all books that document our marine and coastal heritage. The breadth of his publications can be seen by looking at the posters on the wall, but also visit the website of his publishing house, Creekside Publication, to get some idea of the nature and the breadth of the books he's published. So it's fitting that our panellists in this first session are, if I can describe them as determinedly local. Both have, in the course of their lives, have practical experience of living on our coast and have been able to observe and reflect on Suffolk and the sea. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Juliet and Robert. Juliet, if I can begin with you. I've mentioned, I've talked about the easternmost house and the easternmost sky. I've talked about Robert having published 42 books. I know we can never compete with Robert's 42 books, but these weren't your first two books, were they?
No, they weren't my first two books. My first books, shall I say my first 12 books, to try and catch up a bit, were about Speedy, my greyhound, who was an ex-racing greyhound. They were a little bit repetitive. Speedy goes to the sea, a day in the life of Speedy, Speedy down on the farm, and so on. And I might also add that I think they were only 8 pages long, so I'm stretching. But they did raise a lot of money for the Retired Greyhound Trust. And they also opened the door to what you might call proper books in the same style, where I drew the pictures in pencil and watercolour. So then there was Nimrod, which is the life of a household cavalry horse from Fulton retirement, because my husband was in the household cavalry and I heard so many questions about where do the horses come from, do the soldiers know how to ride before they start and all. So I did the whole life of this horse, a typical horse called Nimrod. And that led to then the house pony, which is my personal favourite, and quite ridiculous, although oddly quite serious, pony care, ABC, what you might call it in the highbrow, lowbrow tradition. So that makes 16 in total, I think.
Oh, you addressed some of the values.
So, but I must admit there aren't very many pages in the first 12. But anyway,
sorry, Juliet, could you possibly turn towards us as you speak?
The mic.
Because we keep dropping your voice and we can't hear half the sentence.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. Well, these other books are all available. I think if one goes on to... They're not currently published, but on A-Books you will find them. The Nimrod, the Cavalry Black, is a fascinating book. And also the ABC of Horsemanship is a very interesting book, good for children who are keen on horse riding, and I found it particularly interesting because of the way Juliet was able to use the letter Z. Anyway, right, back to Suffolk and the sea. Juliet, we know about some of us know about the easternmost house. What prompted you to write that?
Well, we were living at Eastern Bavance, and we knew it's important to state that coastal erosion is an ongoing process, and if you look with your eyes at any part of the eroding coast, it's clear that you have limited time. So we went with our eyes open. We lived there eventually for 13 years, and in answer to what sort of prompted the book, in 2015, I think, the house on the edge of the cliff was demolished, and I happened to be photographing it for the record, actually that one, out of interest and for the record, really. And I came in, and Eddie Mayer on Radio 4 was saying, send us your news. There was some kind of IPM or something. And in one sentence, people sent in their news. And mine was, the house on the edge of the cliff was demolished this week, which means we are now the house on the edge of the cliff. And to my amazement, Radio 4 rang up and said, can we come and visit you and interview and walk up down the cliff and whatever. So it turned into a little feature on Radio 4, and quite a lot of people were interested just in the whole scenario. And then my mother-in-law came and more or less lived with us. So I had her. That was the catalyst where I thought, normally I was an architect, sort of. I mean, I am a qualified architect, but I had many different sort of fingers in many pies. Looking after my mother-in-law during the day this was a thing that I could do with her, while also trying to record, in a way, what modern Suffolk country life was like. So it wasn't like old farmers and romantic haystacks. It was metal gates and binder twine and, you know, combines and thinking a little bit about, and along with that was this constant erosion and our time essentially running out. So that was the easternmost house, and it really came about oddly from the demolition of the first house and that strange little interaction with Radio 4, because it just made me feel there might be enough interest in it to write a book, and then it's a matter of luck and judgment getting an agent and publisher. So I feel lucky about that. So,
Robert, was your introduction to authorship as dramatic as Juliet's?
Well, no, it's totally different. Most people come into writing, I think, through either being a journalist or being an academic, that sort of background. I started because of lorry driving. I hurt my back on the farm lorry, and I was laid up a great deal with a bad back. I got nothing to do, and I did start scribbling on bits of paper. Eventually I went to our local doctor in Alderton, and he said, "Oh, you're here again with your back, are you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, we keep patching you up, and you keep going back and doing heavy work on the farm. You've got to leave the farm and do something that doesn't involve lifting stuff around and heavy stuff. It's not going to get better." And actually he was right about that. So I came home and thought, "Oh, I know, I'll be an author." Just like that. So I sat down, and I have to tell you, I was immensely surprised. I thought, like most people do, I must be a genius, because I could just do this. And I wasn't. I plugged on for a long time, writing, and I thought, oh, it's a bit of a waste of time. Nobody's the slightest bit interested in what I write. I eventually sent something to a man called James Wentworth Day, who's been forgotten about now, but he was, back in the 50s, very well-known writer about East Anglia. And he was editing a magazine, and he wrote back, "Your spelling is appalling, your grammar is even worse, but you know how to put a story together, so you've got to go on writing." And I was no end spurred by this. But I still plugged on for a long time, and not a lot happened, really. Apart from that, I was doing the farm as well. I didn't just step back from doing the very heavy stuff and just tried to do management and things. We got quite a big acreage, so there was room for that. I was with my father, and he really wanted to retire and play golf, and I really took over what he was doing. And so I started writing. Eventually, the first book I did, I was in the pub at Snape at the Plough and Sale with George Goodrum, who just bought the Snape Maltings. This is back in '66 or something. And George sort of leaned across and said, "Here, you write in magazines." So I said, "Yes." He said, "Why don't you write up Snape Maltings for me?" So I said, "Yeah, I'll do that." "All right, we'll have a go." So I wrote, the first one was Over Snape Bridge, which was about Snape. And I started writing then. That was actually, because everybody was interested in the Queen coming, nobody could quite understand why an old Maltings was suddenly the Queen was coming to open something there. Everybody was fascinated. It wasn't my book, but it sold very well. It went with a big bang, which gave me a lot of thought, and I thought I have to do. So then I thought, and then I did quite a lot of writing about farming and agriculture, and I thought, well, that's like the day job. I'm doing this in the evening, really, also most of the time, so I must do something that's not the same as the day. I want a relaxation, really, to come home to, and I sail and mess about on boats a lot. So I switched to doing boaty stuff, and I can't remember which book came after that, but I started writing about really traditional boats. First of all in East Anglia, just doing the East Anglian coast and sailing on the East Anglian coast. And then I did a book about Scotland, which I enjoyed doing. The Scots were very puzzled, and I'm not very sure they liked an Englishman coming round researching about their boats, but anyway, we did it. And I did one in Cornwall, and they were even more hostile. But we did it, and that didn't go so well. The Scottish one went all right, the Cornish one didn't go so well, because I included bits of Devon in it. That
was the problem.
Yeah, that was the problem, and I refused, and people said, you'll get in a lot of trouble doing that. And I did really, but anyway, we did that one. And then, what else did I do? In 1982, I did what was really my bestseller. It was a maritime year, 1982, if you can remember it. And I'd done some books for David and Charles. I think I'd done 5 books for David and Charles down in Devon. One a winter, you see, that's how it went. Research in the summer, sit at home and write it in the winter. Anyway, David and Charles said there's a big thing coming up. We'd offered, we were going to make a big book of this. It's going to be called Britain's Maritime Heritage. We'd offered it to various well-known writers, and nobody seemed to want to do it for them. So they asked me. So they said, right, you've got a year to write this book. And so I wrote, and at that stage, I own up to the fact that I was writing with a pen. And my wife, who said, Pearl, long-suffering wife, said, well, if you're really serious about this, I'll learn to type. So she learned to type. And I wrote it in the evening, and then she typed it out next day. We don't do it like that now, but we did for a long while. Anyway, they said, David Charles, you've got a year. And they kept saying, come on, get it finished. They suddenly said, we've heard there's another book coming out. You've got 9 months to do it here. Well, I think I was working in the day as well. And so we were staying up at night, Pearl and me, to do it. And we produced Britain's Maritime Heritage, which was my best-selling book. And it did quite well in 1982, but it's now totally forgotten. It did very well with lending rights as well, actually, because it was in every library. That was the best one I've did with lending rights. Most of the others vanished without trace, you know. We owe you 28p or something, you know, comes at the end of the year. But my last sort of series of one, somebody at Bawdsey Ferry said to me, I'm writing a book. Graham Edison.
Of course.
Graham said, I'm writing a book about the River Devon. Are you going to help me? So I said, yeah, of course I will, Graham. Yeah, and we started off. After a bit, I said to Graham, you're not actually doing any of this. I'm doing it, or I'm doing the... Oh, he said, I've got all these photographs, and I know all about Felixstowe Ferry. He got about 20 photographs as his contribution. So eventually I said to him, well, no, actually, you're not the author. I'm the author of this. And he wasn't very pleased with me and never forgave me. And at his funeral, his daughter, slightly grieved about, stood up and said, my father wrote the Devon River book, helped by Robert Simper. So I was a bit, so anyway, that's how it goes. Anyway, I did a book about the River Devon, which is mainly photographs, which is mainly nostalgia. It's for me, because I was really writing about the 50s and that, and all the people I remember then, which I like. I don't write history, I write nostalgia. Having done one, and it sold very well, and people keep asking me to reprint it, but I won't. That was the first one I was actually involved with the printing, and the publishing, actually. Graham said he'd do it, but he didn't. And then so I thought, well, it's not this publishing job, it's quite fun. I rather enjoy this. I was used to running a business, I have to say, you know, that's what I was doing every day. So running publishing, doing something publishing, I really thought, well, I'll be 2 people now, I'll be a publisher as well. So I did that, I did the Devon, and it went well, and I thought, well, this is such a good idea, everybody will jump on the bandwagon with this. They actually didn't, but I went on and wrote, I think, 8 more books. The Orwell, the Store, the Essex Rivers, Medway, Thames, and I got, well, the last one I did in that series was actually, and there were 8 in the series, was the Fens. And I hope nobody's here from the Fen area, but I had a job to get enthusiastic about the Fens. Also, I'm very enthusiastic about the Suffolk coast and round the Thames estuary and everything, and Cornwall, which I've got a house there. I thought with the Thames, also it was too far to travel to go and meet, because I do like meeting people. The whole thing is I talk to people. It's their story, not mine. I'm always pumping other people for information. I sort of gave up on that one. I can't remember which ones I've done since then. I did one about the cottage I live in. I've lived in a cottage for, which is called Creekside Tales. I thought it was a long time. I thought I'd lived in this cottage 45 years, so I wrote a book about living there, but actually it's about the East Coast. And I now live there 63 years. And then I did various other ones, and I usually boast on sailing. So that's what I've been doing. Plus I write a column in a magazine about sailing ships, which I've been writing again since 1966. I've done in Sea Breezes magazine, I've done a column, which I don't know who reads it, because nobody I know reads it. But whenever I mention this to the editor and say, I'm not sure anybody's reading me now, and he says, yes they do, they keep writing in and saying they want you to carry on with your column. So I write a column about sailing ships. All over the world, I have to say, which is very difficult if you can't go all over the world. Yeah? Okay.
That's absolutely fascinating. Juliet, can I just ask you, Easternmost House and certainly the beginning of Easternmost Sky about the loss of your home. Was that I'm so sorry, yes, we must do that. Was that an easy book to write?
Well, it was interesting because although we knew that our time would be limited, what actually happened when we had to move, normally you would try and move at this time of year. The coastal engineer would, for the sake of the farm who owned the cottages and for general convenience, you would try and do it at a sensible time of year and with reasonable warning. But we thought we would have had at least one more winter and possibly another couple of years. But then it was very interesting in a way. I couldn't help being kind of fascinated. The erosion came in with we'd noticed scouring and some particular storms. And it really came in very, very quickly and diagonally. And then one day Bob, the coastal engineer, said, that we'd have to condemn it. And we were given really a very short time. Originally they gave us a sort of month's notice. Then they said, could we move by the weekend? That was on a Thursday. And the answer to that was no, because even with my local knowledge, my friends, horse boxes, my mother's barn or whatever, you couldn't do it that quickly. But luckily, I tapped out all my various, people I knew and Wright-move and everything, and it so happened that somebody in a small Benneker cottage on the Benneker estate at Cove Hythe had just moved out into a care home, and we luckily, sad for her, but luckily that became available just exactly at the right time, kind of almost like fate. But in answer to the moving out, and what was strange was the demolition. Because although in this book I already imagined, I'm a great believer in mentally rehearsing the things that you know are going to happen, whether that be the death of your dog or a parent or whatever. And therefore I'd mentally rehearsed and actually described before it happened that the wrecking ball would come and these rooms where we'd been so happy would be, fragmented. And slightly against, I did record the demolition because I thought no one else was, and I thought it was interesting, it might be interesting to people in the future. So I did really, I suppose, trespass, although it was a bit strange because some of our things were still there outside, so I didn't feel that much like trespassing, but technically I think it was. And I recorded it quite thoroughly, and I also did that thing that you're not meant to do, walking into a building that's being demolished. But I had a very good understanding of they were taking it down carefully, and I didn't go upstairs, and I knew they were taking it down from the top down, so it wasn't really dangerous. And I took some photos of what had very recently been our sitting room and kitchen, and it was very, very strange. And also that business of being kind of an environmental sort of migrant, I suppose you'd say, that made me think a lot about the future, because we did it in a sort of controlled and knowing way. We knew that it was on an eroding cliff, and it wasn't the same kind of environmental migration that's coming. But I did think having sort of kept an eye on this since I was a student in the sort of 90s, there is going to be a lot of migration. This book, Powers of 10, some of you may be aware of, it's a flip book that goes from a picnic couple, and it zooms out, times 10, times 10, times 10, and that made me think about sort of zooming out, as it were, from our little patch to what does that mean for East Anglia, and then you do that thing that children do to the world, the universe, and so on. So it made me think a little bit in a broader way that this was happening on our coast, but then when I don't think ours was specifically to do with climate change, because it was erosion, but it was quite noticeable that there did seem to be increasing strength and frequency of storms, but that equally could have just been a natural phase. But with the climate and the sea levels and all of that, I'm sure that is going to cause an enormous amount of sort of environmental migration where people are not really prepared for it. Fairborn in Wales has already been condemned, and you've got low-lying areas, Bangladesh, and so on. So I think that just that phrase, it made me think enormously, not so much about us, but the future people, Polynesian islands, and all of that, really. So for that reason, it was quite, I put the phrase in a way to spark other people's imagination of what it might mean, rather than sort of victimising us where we were well prepared and had somewhere to go. I think that particular, being an environmental migrant or an environmental refugee, I think that's going to be much of a phrase that we're going to get to hear more.
The subject of your book, of course, is about something really quite traumatic, that is the loss of your house, and also this wider subject of the effect of the environment, the effects on the environment of climate. Did you enjoy writing it?
Well, yes, because I've really, from a very long time ago, when I was an architecture student, been always with an eye looking about 25 years ahead of where I am. And I have to say I've been fairly accurate in being a soothsayer. But I think it's to do with being observant of current moods. And so I'm always looking sort of ahead of what change is likely to come. What are we going to eat? Is there going to, there's a sort of rise of veganism and lab-grown meat. There's a huge change in attitude. Animals and social license is my own, public opinion is my current sort of subject. For example, there are cat curfews, and the vets have condemned flat-faced dogs. And there was a survey this week by World Horse Welfare that found that 20% of the UK public disapprove of the use of horses in sport under any circumstances. And I thought that was an amazingly high number. And although it's nothing much to do with the sea, it is to do with looking ahead to what attitudes are coming down the line and trying to meet them, to get ahead of them, so that it isn't a shock. You know that either you are going to die first, or your parents are. Logically, one has to happen. So you mentally rehearse for that. If you have a dog, it's likely that the dog's life will end before yours, so you mentally rehearse for that. So in a way, living with the erosion made you have to look ahead, in a way, to what will happen when we have to move, how will we do it, and it made me also look in this powers of 10 kind of way to see what would happen in the future to the coast, and in a way to the world, I suppose.
Robert, you've lived, as we know, on the river and on the coast for a long time. Have you seen dramatic changes, and as dramatic as Juliet's?
Yes, I actually live by the River Deben. Yes, it's changing dramatically, yes. When I say dramatically, I think an awful lot of people on the river who just come in the summer and sail about a bit don't notice it. You've got to be really there. But it is, and there's also erosion is happening along the River Deben. The Deben itself is trying to change course, whether that's because it's natural for rivers to change course, they all change course, or whether there's more water coming in. The government puts out a lot of propaganda about the sea level rising. Well, it's actually gone on, so I'm told, rising at exactly the same level. That there obviously is climate change. My own farming records, which I keep, you know, of what the rainfall is and things, it's definitely getting less rain here. I don't know where that's going. The government wants to abandon any form of sea against the sea, and I fully sympathise with it. It's extremely expensive, but the Dutch, the other side of the North Sea, don't have any erosion. They just won't have it, and they go to enormous lengths. The most extreme I've seen is Den Helder. I don't know if you've ever been to a town of Den Helder in Northern Holland, where you can walk on the river wall and you are looking down on the rooftops of 3-story houses. It's that they've already got that high, and that they're going on packing more dirt on it. They don't stop, they just keep dredging it out the North Sea and making the walls higher and higher. And people are saying, oh, well, we can't repair the river walls on the River Deben. They're already 12 foot high. You can't make them any higher. And if you go to Holland, they're about 30 or 40 foot high already. And the best of luck to them, because life, and I'm told, which I'm not sure about, somebody assured me that Amsterdam was 25 feet below sea level. I don't know whether that's true. I've not looked that up, but and he was a Dutchman. So, you know, it's wonderful. You don't have to have erosion, and the economics of it, of defending the coast, are horrendous. But what do you go? Which way do you go?
I'm going to ask you a question which I may be told off for being ageist. Do you remember the 53 flood?
Yes.
Can you tell us? No, I did.
No, I was actually not. I didn't actually see it there. I was actually at boarding school, so I didn't actually physically know it. I have an uncle who, I relay his story, who was here in Felixstowe. He farmed Beach Station Farm, if you know, down near what was Felixstowe Dock. He farmed the land that was, he had a cattle farm there. We were really cattle farmers originally. And he was there to have cattle on the marshes there. And right at the end of his life, which is not that long ago, Derek Simper, I did finally manage to drag out of him the story of his story, which is probably I'll do it second hand. Most of my stories are second hand to start with. But I said, I made him go through it. And you were in bed, you'd had a normal, he said, oh yeah, it was blowing a gale. How did you know that your house was flooded? What happened? Oh, he said, that wasn't very difficult. I heard the windows breaking, and I heard a sudden bang, and the windows all broke. And by the time I got to the top of the stairs, the water was coming up to meet me. And he then had a rather horrid time, because he opened the window to look at the sea, and he could hear the people on the caravan side, the other side of the railway tracks near the station. There was a sort of caravan village where people lived, but they lived there full time. He could hear the women and the children screaming. And I don't remember how many were drowned there, but quite a lot, some of you here, not 20, but quite a lot of people were drowned, and he did hear all that. Anyway, after a little while, his neighbour's dog came swimming past, and he grabbed a hold of the collar and pulled this Labrador out, and the Labrador was absolutely delighted and jumped into his bed, soaking wet. Oh, Derek, yeah, the thing that he remembered most, he said, yes, I hate to tell you the swear words he used. He said, that dog. He said, I had to spend the rest of my life sleeping on the edge of the bed with a wet dog. Anyway, in the morning, he looked out the window again, and a tractor tyre floated past. So he thought, well, that's the way out. So he, I don't know, made a paddle or something. He climbed out the window, got on the tractor tyre, and paddled his way ashore with the dog. And he met his neighbours, and they said, "Oh, we've lost that. Oh, our dog's gone." He said, "No, it hasn't. The damn thing is here." So that's the second-hand story. And I came home, and it was all flooded then. My parents were very against. My parents, by the way, didn't like the sea and water, and they were always trying to keep me away from it. All my youth, they were spent trying to keep me away from water, because they came from inland and they mistrusted water, and I quite liked going on it. I saw what had happened, yes.
My mother and there's a story in my family. My mother and father-in-law were living in Bawdsey at the time. My father-in-law was in the Royal Air Force, and they were quartered at one of the White houses on the riverfront, number 4. My wife was living there as well, and the story in the family is that they all went to bed on the night before the storm or the deluge, unsuspecting, and they woke up the next morning and my mother-in-law drew the curtains back and apparently said, "Frank, there's a boat in our front garden." And my wife tells the story as well that her mother was very keen to assist the soldiers that came to help with the reparations afterwards, and she was good at making cups of tea. Apparently it was not an intended consequence, but my wife and her sister made quite a lot of money in pennies and tuppences from carrying cups and mugs of tea to the soldiers. Yeah, so, yeah.
Do you want my father's story?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
How was that, Bawdsey? Well, much the same. They lived on Manor Farm. Bawdsey was on top of a hill. It's 50 foot above the sea. Even though some maps Environment Agency produced to put it on under flood level. They didn't know anything about it till again I looked at the morning. Father, he liked his chickens, and he had his chickens down on the marsh below the house, and when he went down to see his chickens, they were all sitting on top of the chicken house. So he went down to Ramsholt Dock, where we had a dinghy, a rowing dinghy, and he rowed up from Ramsholt up to Bawdsey Fleet. He rowed up Bawdsey Fleet and rescued his chickens. So that was that. But the thing is, really, he counted, as he rowed along, he counted all the breaks there was in the wall.
Yeah.
And between Ramsholt Quay and Bawdsey Ferry, there were 23 breaks. Mm. So it was fairly dramatic. And then, as you say, there were soldiers there filling up sandbags and things, and the London Fire Brigade pumping it all out. And they filled all those gaps up and made up the river wall.
Yeah. Juliet, you told us, you've mentioned Powers of 10.
Yes.
Available on YouTube, I think?
Yes, you can look it up. If you just look up Powers of 10, they did as a film. But I do find it quite fascinating because it does make you think a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And as well as going out, sort of very quickly you're in sort of outer space, to use a scientific. But equally, they go into the sort of microscopic level of going into us. And it just makes you think differently. I think it's an interesting, it just made me think a bit in a certain way.
I can recommend it if anybody's interested. Go on to YouTube, Powers of 10.
You just look up Powers of 10 and it'll probably that will be, a little YouTube film.
Yeah.
It's very old, sort of 1970s. For some reason it's very popular with architects and designers, and I don't know why. I think it helps them think laterally. That's how I discovered it in the first place, and it was quite helpful in the writing of this book. And with the floods, when my mother-in-law came in 2013, I suppose it must be, Southwold had marvellous exhibitions and memories of the people who'd lived through it, and it was literally the first week that she was with us, and I thought it would be good to take her along to the church, hear it, see the films, meet some of the people, whatever. And then I thought afterwards, with these really quite sinister and dramatic tales of rescuing ponies off the marshes and the little timber houses being washed away, I thought, and these frightening photos, I thought possibly that was a bit of a dramatic sort of baptism of fire, but the opposite. But in a funny way, understanding what had happened and meeting people who were telling stories like yours was actually a very bonding thing. She immediately felt part of the place more than she would have without that, I think. Coincidence, largely, and sort of participating in local events.
You've told us about the influence of Powers of Ten. Have there been any other books that influenced your writing?
Well, when I started, I wanted the actual title, The Easternmost House. I had the idea that you have to have a unique title, that if you call your book, say, Time and Tide, there are going to be other books. So I had read a book called The Outermost House, which was a year of life on the Great Beach in Cape Cod in, I think, the 20s, by Henry Beston. And although his style is quite laboured, I like the idea of being out there on the beach. And that book, The Outermost House, gave me the Easternmost House title. And the other book that was a bit of an influence in a strange way was Gavin Maxwell, Ring of Bright Water, living up there in Scotland in a place I know. The first half of the book really doesn't have any otters in it at all, and it's slightly questionable whether one should keep an Iraqi otter as a pet, which comes in a different book of his, the trilogy. But it was just the way he improvised and lived with the weather, and I just found his style of living and thinking quite appealing. And I also like the timelessness of that book, that if you read it now it would still be quite you could read it now and it would seem dated but not absurd, you know. So I was basically those two. I was trying to write a book that would be in some way timeless, I suppose, while also depicting modern life, so that in the future people would be interested in the minutiae and detail of it.
I came across in the Easternmost Sky something you wrote, amazingly self-deprecating. In the unlikely event that I will suddenly change tack and do something truly worthwhile in my life, to the extent that I might be honoured with an invitation to appear on Desert Island Discs, I would seriously consider taking as my chosen book The Penguin Completes Saki. Why was that?
Saki, I love Saki, because always there are animals, farm animals usually, or some rather uncouth kind of animal, very often in quite formal and grand situations, causing mayhem.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry. Saki I love because there are always animals, uncouth, misbehaving, bargy kind of farm animals, and they're usually in some quite grand situation. And I suppose it's the disruption of normal manners and just the general absurdity and sort of slight surrealism, I suppose. And I think it's a little bit like the royal family. They love it when things go wrong, and perhaps the more formal the occasion, the more they love it when things go wrong. And I think if you put horses or ferrets or farm animals in a drawing room or whatever. And also there are lots of fabulous aunts, evil aunts and all kinds of aunts, and I love that too. And I think one of them gets killed by a ferret or something. Anyway, the darkness, the humour, animals, grand settings, it all works for me.
Has anybody read Saki in the audience? Yeah?
H.H. Munro, his name is, I think. And he has all these short stories, beasts and super beasts. I think he was Edwardian, and his generation would have been basically the First World War generation.
Well, it'll be interesting because on Monday next week I'm going on a very long plane journey, and prompted by Juliet's comment, I bought a copy. So I shall let you know when I get back as to whether I agree with your assessment of it. Robert, your latest book is about the village of Ramsholt. How did that come about?
By living there a long time.
Oh,
For years I've been, Ramsholt's a small village, in fact some people don't realise it's a village at all, and I've always collected history about it, but I've never managed to tie it all together. And about 5 years ago, I thought, I used to do a book a year. I'm not doing that now. But about 5 years ago, I thought I must write the history of Ramsholt. And I can't really write a history of Ramsholt because there's a lot I haven't tied up yet. I've still got a lot of things. And I thought, well, I'm getting older, and I'm also, which is even worse, I'm forgetting things. I go to try and remember people's names and dates and things, and I find they're no longer there. So I thought, right, I'll do Ramsholt before I forget the blooming lot. So I did Ramsholt, and also it was lockdown, I wasn't, etc. and all that. It was quite good to have something to do, which required a lot of it, a lot of research. And I've done a small one of Ramsholt. I could have done a massive long one, but there are all sorts of, you don't know, people appear on the scene in history, and especially in a small place, make a great impact and then vanish and then sort of go away, and I think that's how life is. So that's why I did Ramsholt.
That was the last book you published. Any more books in the pipeline?
Well, sort of, yes.
Do you share any of this, or is it a secret?
Well, I'd like to do another one. I was going to do, I actually wrote a book on the Demon, which I've got sitting at home, but some other people have made a film, which I helped them to make.
Is that Life on the River Demon?
Yeah, Life on the Demon. I helped them.
Yes.
And I told them a lot of stuff, and then they decided to do a book. So I've sort of held back. I thought you can't have too many books coming out on the same subject.
Yeah.
So I've actually got a book on the demon sitting there, and I can't remember what's in it now, but it's probably interesting. That's about 3 years ago I did that. And then I wrote one about barging experience, because somebody asked me to. The publisher asked me and said, oh, you went on barges a lot, would you write about your experience of barges? So I did one last winter on barges. And then when I went back to the publisher, he said, oh, I don't know about that. I said, oh, all right. And I was rather, but I've still got it all there. And that's happened to me before when I was writing with different publishers. One publisher would commission something and then say, I don't think we'll do that now. No. Or it's always word of mouth. We haven't got the record. And then I'd keep it a bit and sell it to somebody else. So nothing is wasted. Nothing is wasted.
I don't know whether on the bookstall at the back, whether Life on the River Demon is there. Is a book? Perhaps not.
No, I'm afraid, because Nick Cotton
yes.
Is hosting our next session. Please stay for Nick Cotton.
Yes.
But he tells me that Life on the Demon is now temporarily or permanently out of print, so maybe Robert's big
I shall leave a respectable gap, and then I might resurrect it again. It was a very good book, actually.
Another reason to go to A Books to find a copy, because it is very,
it's a jolly good book. They did a good job.
And it,
totally different to what I would have written, which is always fun.
And it came with a no, it didn't come with, but there was a DVD of it as well.
Yeah.
Juliet, anything in the pipeline?
Yes, I'm currently obsessed with the idea of animals and social license in the internet age, with particular thoughts about social media and how information going around that is sometimes not correct can, in the past it hasn't really mattered, but if it starts to infiltrate real life, for example, this past week with Royal Ascot, the Prime Minister's wife was put on Twitter with a picture of a dead horse. Why are you going racing? And it turned out the horse had actually died in America in 2006, with the implication that it had died of heat stroke at Ascot. Now, in the past, that might not have mattered, because you could simply say that it was wrong and why pick on her anyway. I don't know the Prime Minister's wife, but 70,000 other people a day went to Royal Ascot, and therefore at the moment racing does have social license. But with the Saki stories, it gives you a little, and the animals in houses, it gives you a little thought about what we look back at to see as being entirely wrong, really. For example, that was my intro to talking about Somerleyton Hall, the polar bears in the hall, taxidermy well, we wouldn't shoot polar bears now, but that also led into how much in 2 generations that family has changed from, or 3 generations actually, from shooting polar bears to Hugh Crossley being that Saki bit led to polar bears in the hall, and then straight on to Wild East and rewilding and Hugh Cross Street and all of that. But what it did show was in 2 or 3 generations how our attitudes change. So that's why Saki shoehorned his way into that chapter. But I think so, and I've also written, I've got a couple of sort of in the drawer kind of books, one of which is about a man called Thomas Wright, who was an 18th century architect, astronomer, an all-time lovely man who built follies and castles for cows, and I've been obsessed with him since I was a student, and I terribly want him to become a national treasure, to the point that I'm thinking seriously of self-publishing on the internet the book I've already written about him, just so people know about him. I mean, if I could, I would just literally have them print on demand and literally give it to everyone so they knew about him. But I'm not.
You want to try Creekside Publications?
But he's a very, very interesting man, Thomas Wright. So that's already done. So I don't. And the one I'm doing at the moment is this business of animals, looking at cats, dogs, horses, ceremonial animals, animals at work, animals in food, also things like sentimentality, balloon releases, don't get me started, then going into the sea, which brings us back to the sea again, balloon releases and sea plastic killing wildlife. So taking us some blame really, for breeding pugs or whatever. And my granny had pugs, so I feel, slightly able to point the finger at us as well.
Well, we look forward to both the future books from Robert and from Juliet. We're fast running out of time, sadly. Do any members of the audience have questions for either? Yes, sir.
For Robert Simper, the flood, the 53 flood, did your uncle or your parents comment on the weather leading up to it? Was it very stormy, windy, and lashing with rain?
Yes, it was. Yes, there was. There was a gale. Probably they didn't really rate the gale bigger than anything else. It was a combination of a whole series of things coming together, a very high tide, and then the gale stopping the water up in the North Sea. The water couldn't get out of the North Sea because the gale was holding it up, and it was just, the perfect storm, and it can happen again at any time. Yeah.
I think one of the factors in the 53 flood, and I don't want to be too controversial, was in fact years and years of neglect of the sea defences. And there's a very good manuscript. It's not in book form yet, by a man called P.J. Trist, T-R-I-S-T, and he was a county agricultural officer. He went up in a plane the following day and he followed the coast and he wrote it's about a 35-page manuscript on the effects of the flood. There are some who are attempting to get this published, but yes, madam in the yellow.
What characterises your writing, Robert, is your love for the Suffolk people and their connection with places that you're describing.
Yeah.
But fewer and fewer people live off the land or dependent on the sea. Have you noticed a difference in the kinds of people and the qualities of the people?
Oh, totally different attitude. Totally different attitude. I grew up in Bordsey, and then I've lived most of my life in Ramsholt. And to start with, more or less everybody in Bordsey and the whole area worked on the farms. Can I not? Sorry. Growing up in the countryside in Bordsey, everybody in the villages worked on the farms. The towns depended, like Woodbridge and Wickham Market, they depended a great deal on the trade from farmers, bought them one way and another. And so I wouldn't say everybody was they certainly weren't pro-farmers. They always thought they were a mean old lot, and some of them were. But they wanted us to produce food. We've now done a complete circle. Most of the people living in the villages now are urban upbringing, and they've moved out into the countryside, and they can't see the point of big tractors and sprays and things, and they're all saying, oh, well, and people say to me, why don't you rewild your farm, you know? Well, it wouldn't worry me at my age too much, but actually it should worry you, because every field and land and trees that are planted, that's less food being produced in this country. There are other ways of producing food, which I watch with interest, you know, greenhouses and things. And even now, we just straightforward traditional farming, we can't do it. We can't feed everybody, but there needs to be some sort of industrial food production. But there's a sort of people living in the countryside, and they don't connect the fields. They see a big tractor in a field, and they thought, oh, that's absolutely terrible. I mean, we must do it. I mean, I've been to a party, and people said, we must do away with these big tractors. That's why the food in the shops is so cheap. In the supermarkets, it's cheap, because, and if you went back to organic farming or anything like that, you just couldn't produce it at the same price.
Does the quality of people change? Are there any Suffolk people left?
Very few, very few. In Bordsey, there's only about 3 people who speak with a Suffolk accent. If you want to hear the Suffolk accent properly, you have to go into Chancery Park in Ipswich. It's a stronghold of the Suffolk accent. Yes,
gentleman in the back.
Sir.
Just to comment, the 53 floods, there were 41 people died in Felixstowe, and there's a memorial down at Langer Road School, primary school.
Thank you for that. Yes.
What was that?
There's a memorial to the people in Langer Road. Yes, madam.
A question for Juliet. What became of the new easternmost house?
What's on the site now is a cabin called the Easternmost Cabin that the farm gets a rental income from, and they have 2 holiday sort of cabins plus the Easternmost Cabin. But the land has gone back, so that the house that we lived in is not there at all. It's become a cabin so that the farm still gets some income. But it's a difficult farm. We're talking about at Bennica they've got 7,000 acres. They're losing 35 acres a year. And I grew up in the Saints, which is a place where you could hear plenty of Suffolk accents. But I've worked quite a lot. We used to grow apples, but that was all grubbed up in the 80s. But I did a lot of work on the land as a teenager, picking, and even since moving back home, as I would think it, I've worked on vineyards, I've been the skipper's mate on the coastal voyage of boat, I've written, I've been an architect, all at the same time. And, it's unusual really. People are always surprised. I know people that do hedge laying in the winter and write for shooting times in the summer or whatever, We have to all be multi-traded, and my urban friends, which I must admit I rather left behind, but the people I knew from architecture or who are still in London, or just generally that is the predominant attitude in newspapers say, they're often really surprised at how we all do many different jobs, that you could be doing this, but I could also be pruning or picking or thinning the leaves off the vines on Monday. It so happens I'm not going to be, but that is typically what we do.
Yes, Robin.
Robert mentioned quite a number of his books, and one he said he didn't think was as thorough that he would have liked, which is The Pen book. I've read pretty or so of Robert's books.
I forgot you were here.
The Pen book I found one of the most interesting of the ones I've read. I was born and bred in Cambridge, and he provided quite a lot of information about the Cambridge area, which I had no idea about, and I would recommend it as a book.
Well, really, that's very nice of you to say that, but really, if I write a book on an area, Scotland, Cornwall, Suffolk, anywhere, I get well into it, I get completely into it and go and meet people, and for 6 months or a year or something, that's the centre of the life. This is right, what you do, and then when it's finished you think, well, you move on to something else. You can't retain all this stuff on your head. A cousin of mine bought a house in Norfolk, on the Norfolk Broads, and she came and she was telling me some stuff about where she was, And I said, oh, that's fascinating. Where did you get that? And she said, well, I got it out of your book, didn't I? Out of your book on Norfolk. And I said, I don't remember that. Where did I get that from? But I get absolutely into a subject. You can't keep it all in your head. That's why you write the book, to get it all out. And I particularly am trying to record what's happening now and what's happened in the past. I'm just making a record.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there is one. Yes, right at the very back.
I've got a question for Robert. I'm talking maybe your books are full of good anecdotes. You tell good stories. And I just wondered whether, when you start a book, do those anecdotes come as part of the writing, or do you make a list of something? Because, as I say, your books have a very personal touch.
I don't know now. I just start at the beginning, and what I start with is a title. Sometimes, if I'm really clever, I can do a list of chapters, and then I just start at the beginning, and I just keep going. And one day I think, oh, I've had enough of this. I'll work this subject out, and then you take it to the printers, and it can be short or long. I don't mind.
Ladies and gentlemen,
when you finish.
We have been beaten by the clock.
Yeah.
Well, Robert just said, you've finished, you've had enough of it. I don't think we've had enough of it. I'd like to thank Peter, Juliet and Robert for a magnificent first session. We've got a rather scanty quarter of an hour for our next session with Nick, Claudia and Jane. You've got a chance to speak to Juliet and Robert, to buy their books, to ask them to sign their books. But then I'm going to have to say to you, back in the seats, 11:15, Claudia, Jane and Nick. So, off we go.